gentlemen, it's Logan Staats here. I'm here with Marc Laferriere, candidate from the NDP, through the red door. Just having a little chat.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. I mean, this has been, I was happy to take the invite and just have a chat, you know. No scripts, no notes, just two guys talking about issues or whatever you want to talk about. Oh, and you're going to even face me. This is great.
I'm going to try to. Talk to us. Why should we vote? Why should Native people vote?
Well, first thing we got to make sure we mention, and I want to make sure I mention, is that you don't have to. When I knock on doors in Brantford, and there's a lot of folks from Six Nations who are living in Brantford, and a lot of times they'll say, well, I don't vote, and I say, you know, I respect that, because it's conscientious objection. It's not, you know, like when I talk to some people who say, oh, voting, I'm too busy, or voting, I don't care, or voting, I don't know. It's actually a reasoned choice, and I get it. Mm-hmm. I also know that there are a lot of folks on Six Nations that do vote. And I know from the last election, when we got a conservative majority, that there are a lot of people, especially younger people, who said, yeah, you know what, next time I am going to vote. And a lot of them reached out to me. A lot of folks I went to high school with, I went to Assumption, right, with a lot of folks who reached out and said, you know, we need some change. And I know some folks have the idea that, and I'm not going to disagree with it, that, you know, there's an element of revoking of some part of citizenship in order to you know, be a part of a...
That's a big kind of stigma that's going on out here.
Well, and actually, you know what? It's something that's been pushed by the government as well, because they don't want First Nations to vote. They don't want Indigenous votes because they tend not to vote for them, the current government. And so, I'll give you an example. We had a lady who came in and said, you know, I don't want to lose my Mohawk citizenship if I vote. And the very first question, we said, okay, we talked to her, explained how that's not what happens, and that you have a franchise that you're allowed to use, and there are some practical things that can happen if you do vote. But we go onto the Elections Canada website, and the very first question to register her says, are you a Canadian citizen? And she's saying, well, yes, but no, you know, and I don't want to, and it says revoking all other citizenships. And she said, well, no, that doesn't describe me completely, and was very perplexed and said, you know, I have to go look into this, took a sign, but was like, I have to go look into this more before I decide. I get that. I also see how things like First Nations fire is underfunded, how First Nations, huge, when you talk to Chief Miller, myself and Gene Crowder, we were talking to Matt, and we went and we met with him, and, you know, you're more likely to die in a fire if you're Indigenous. And I went and did my master's up in Thunder Bay, and, you know, some of the fire issues that are there, huge. And, you know, in Peterborough, $75 per person. That's the per capita rate that they give them per year for their fire. Wow. Six Nations, $25.
Wow.
Right? With huge infrastructure compared to most First Nations, with huge issues when it comes to safety and fire and the rest.
Reservation in Canada, right?
Well, that's it. That's it. And it's completely underfunded. Shannon's Dream is another one that, you know, Charlie Angus, myself, and others took a lead on when it comes to the NDP to say, look, education shouldn't be underfunded 70%. You know, if you're in a provincial system, you get a full dollar per, let's say it's 100% of the funding. First Nations get about 70%. So 70 cents on the dollar to First Nation education. And guess what? First Nations' highest growing birth rate. Like, we need folks, even the Chamber of Commerce. You don't often think of the Chamber of Commerce as maybe an ally to First Nations, but they're saying, hey, conservatives, get off your butts and make sure that it's funded properly, because this is going to be the growing part of the workforce. And what are we doing? So there's all these things that are happening. And I have also talked to people at Six Nations, older people, who said, you know, I voted. I don't feel any less Native, right? So I get the disparity there, and I'm you know, if you don't want to vote, if you're dead set against it, hey, I'm not going to convince you to vote anyway. But if you are voting, I think that we're the best choice for having that ally, for making that change, and locally for really getting it. So.
Yeah. On the reservation right now, something that we're dealing with is Bill C-10. And I was just wondering where NDP sits in regards to that issue.
Yeah, I don't think that it's had the full debate even in the caucus that it needs to. And I think by bringing myself in, if I'm elected, I mean, that's something I can do. It's an issue because on one hand you have, you know, convenience stores and the rest talking about contraband tobacco, but that's not what this is.
No.
Right? And my thing is we've taken groups of people throughout Canada. I teach this, right? I teach Justice Studies and Police Foundations at Mohawk, and Mohawk College, and we talk all the time about, well, why are some of the things the way they are, you know? We took all the best land and we put settlers in it, and then we pushed everybody else out who was already here, all the Indigenous people, and then every time that they're developing something economically, we're trying to cut into it. So if you look at what's happening with tobacco, I mean, here's one of the few things on Six Nations that's really an economic driver, and it's under threat.
Yeah, it's like...
So what's going to happen if this bill goes through? Will we have more people unemployed, more people, having to utilize government programs?
Exactly.
Will we have more poverty, more disparity, more inequality? It sounds like that to me. So, I look at the idea of maybe exemption for First Nations, like we've done in things like fishing. But we also need better economic development and skills training too, so that isn't such a huge part of the economic landscape. It's like, you need to have the diversity, and here, I mean, my goodness, what could the options be with partnership was actually happening if there was a good nation-to-nation relationship between our governments, as opposed to what's been happening, which is, I find the province is pointing this way, the city of Brantford is pointing this way, the county of Brant's pointing this way, Six Nations is pointing this way, federal government's pointing that way. And it's an issue because the federal government's the one that needs to actually step up to the plate in real partnership. I had a column a while back in the Brant News saying, some options for land rights as an example. And, I gave it 8 different options. One of them has to be to come back to the table, to drop the whole only one voice can speak for Six Nations. We can have all these other settler voices, but we can only have one voice for Six Nations. That's ridiculous. And also to remove this idea of a cap. The Conservatives have said 150 million, and we're never going to go for anything in perpetuity. I think that's not how you negotiate. They're not even negotiating, and they're already drawing the lines. I think you got to go in with the open attitude and figure that out. But when it comes to C10, I mean, we've had some really interesting conversations. Ava Hill, Mayor Friel, and members of the county council, Six Nations elected council, and the city council met with me and Tom Mulcair and Romeo Saganash in Ottawa, and we talked about things like what if Six Nations was able to keep their excise tax on, for self government, for being able to fund their own programs. There's lots of misconceptions out in Brantford about things like people don't understand the leakage studies. That a lot of money that comes here gets spent there. They don't understand that First Nations do pay taxes. They actually pay more taxes than they get back. And the excise tax, we were talking upwards of $200 million a year that could go to fund the programs that are needed here for a better way of life. And guess what? Better way of life here is a better way of life for the entire riding.
Exactly. A really big kind of thing that's going on across First Nations is missing and murdered Aboriginal women right now. And I'm just wondering where you sit on that, and how the NDP feels about this issue.
Sure. Yeah. Me personally, I mean, I've worked with clients who've gone missing when I was a social worker, and I've worked with families who have had to deal with those horrible losses and the trauma. And you look at some of the systems issues. I look at it this way. The population of First Nations people in Canada is the same as New Brunswick. If 1,200 plus, and we know it's actually more than 1,200, but if 1,200 plus women and girls went missing or murdered in New Brunswick, we would have the military there. We would have an inquest. We would have police services enhanced. We would have helping services enhanced. We'd have education in every school in New Brunswick. We would be on the manhunt. We would deal with the social ills associated with it. And when it's spread out across the country and it's First Nations, suddenly it's seen as less than. And frankly, that's and a lot of white politicians won't say this, but it's the mixture of racism and sexism all put into one. So I teach about this at the college, and we look at the stats that show white men have the best socioeconomic outcomes, and then white women, and then multicultural men, then multicultural women, and then First Nations men, and then First Nations women. So that leaves them economically vulnerable and socially vulnerable, and that's not how it's supposed to be. So there's huge issues, and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission have looked into pieces of that, but we've promised within the first 100 days to begin an inquest, national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women. There have been so many studies that are done, but none of the action that's needed has been taken. So, okay, let's take all the studies, let's do this sort of Uber study, and then actually have the recommendations. And you have to do it as a national inquiry so that it's not just governments playing politics with it. It's groups outside of government saying, these are the actual core issues. Don't politicize it. We know. We did the study. We made sure that we have good recommendations that come from across a variety of sources. But we need to make sure that we're enhancing people's ability to get the help they need. So economically, but also socially.
Yeah.
I was part of a great program with my friend Doug Doolittle in Brant Native Housing called
Yeah.
Kijia Anishinaabe Nin,
Oh, okay.
which is the Kind Man program. And it's awesome. It takes the 7 grandfather teachings and it helps men. And in Brantford, they do it for First Nations men and settler men as well. It's the only one I think that does that. And it's the best outcomes for participation and graduation rates in all of Ontario. And what they do is they teach the 7 grandfather teachings. And they teach men who've been abused and are abusive or have been abusive to be kinder, to love more, to play. To They also have a kind grandfather program, or grandfather program, and anyway, it's a wonderful program, and one like that actually also helps the men who are struggling, because the men are hurting too.
Oh man.
And they're dealing with loss, and they're dealing with sometimes interpersonal violence, and it's a horrible issue. I just know that if it was happening somewhere else,
Yeah, it would be a lot different.
It would be a lot different. I mean, look, even with water, right? So 80-something% of the wells are contaminated on 6 Nations. If that happened in St. George or Burford, it would be fixed.
Yeah.
Here it's been decades.
Exactly.
Right? And I think that comes to what we're talking about, finding ways to enhance that nation-to-nation relationship, to enhance self-government. Like, the excise tax, for example, that idea that Ava had, I think it's a really good idea.
Yeah, we were speaking about that the other day. I think that's a good idea.
And meeting with people and in a way that's open. We need a new relationship. The current Conservative government hasn't been the right fit, but the Liberals before that, they did some good things too, but they didn't solve a lot of this either. We've had the same inequality, not just for First Nations but in general, and we've had 150 almost years of the same 2 parties, and I think even if it's just once, if they got shaken up, everybody else would have to smarten up.
Yeah.
Right?
I did a lot of touring this year. I was all over the country. I did a lot of work in BC.
Nice.
And a big issue out there was the pipelines and everything that's going on. And I'm just wondering what you plan to do, or NDP plans to do, to resolve this issue.
Yeah, well, I think there's 2 things that we need. One is an environmental process that people actually trust. We need more than just consultation with First Nations, but we need them to buy in, or if they don't, then they don't. Like, you need consent, not just consultation.
Yeah.
Consultation's a funny one, because you can find 10 people that'll agree with you and call it consultation. That's not the same thing as consent, right? And when it comes to pipelines, we've said that in principle we'd be interested in one that went from west to east, and then do the manufacturing and the jobs here, and not lose them to the States. But they'd have to pass an actual rigorous environmental process, and we'd need consent, not just consultation from First Nations if it was to go through. Some will, some won't. Does that mean that a pipeline's going to happen? No, but if it does happen, it'll happen with rigor and not sort of willy-nilly. That said, we also have to look at what's been going on when it comes to our lakes and rivers. Right? We've lost federal protection on millions of lakes and rivers. So one of the things I was working on with a guy named Craig Scott, he was the MP who became the MP after Jack Layton died in his riding, is something called the Grand River Protection Act, as an example. And part of it was really to shame the Conservatives who have taken all the federal protections off of most of our lakes and rivers. And they say, well, it's needless, it's doubling up. Well, if that's true, why'd you keep it on some? Right? If it's useless, then get rid of it. Don't say, well, it's useless, except for in these Conservative ridings where it's really important, like Huntsville, right? And no knock on Tony Clement, but if it's important enough for his riding to keep their lakes and rivers protected, why not the Nith? Why not the Grand? Especially, I got engaged on the Grand, I got married on the Grand. I want my kids to play on the Grand, and I know so many of the businesses and the homes there. I live on the Nith. They're wondering what happens without that federal protection, because we've seen, there are provincial protections, but we've seen things around the mining industry and some of the tailing ponds and things like that where it can be misused now. So we want to also bring that back, and part of that would also be to make it more rigorous if any pipelines were to come through. Bill C-51 is something we have to talk about, even though it's not specifically environmental. What it's also proposing is to allow too loose a definition on what is terror and what is terrorism. If a First Nations group or any other group was to say, we want to be, one of the part of the wording is around anything that gets in the way of the economic interests of Canada. Well, stopping a train, having a blockade at a road that trucks pass by, and protesting pipelines would all technically be out of what the Conservatives would consider the economic interests of Canada.
Terrorists.
Yeah, well, and I wouldn't be as worried about it if environmentalists weren't called radicals by this government. If Sherry Lewis told me once, she says, you get eight of us on a corner and everybody thinks we're starting a protest. It's you need to be able to have legitimate process to these things, because tankers and pipelines are not necessarily safe, and we've seen leaks and we've seen spills and we've seen issues. So having that not just consultation, but again consent, making sure that we have federal protection on all our lakes and rivers, and if it doesn't pass environmental standards, really good environmental standards, then they shouldn't happen.
Yeah.
Right.
Tell me a little bit about yourself and what brought you into politics and your history.
Sure. Yeah. When I was a kid, we didn't have a bus at my high school. Okay. And my mom was on the system. She had some mental health issues and some physical health issues, and they called it mother's allowance back then. And my dad was in the picture, but not here. He lived in sort of Ottawa, Quebec area. And I got 2 sisters there as well, and it's good. At the same time, I had my grandmother Isabel, who actually taught at Six Nations, and she taught in the Northwest Territories when she was 19. Oh. Her name was Isabel Allen, and she taught here. She always taught me about volunteerism and also social justice. So she volunteered a lot. I remember she broke her arm once, and she was still volunteering all the time. And places I'd go after she passed away, that she volunteered at, people would know who I was, and like tears in their eyes about her, and that teaches you about something. Yeah. She also was this little, like, very polite British woman who because she taught here on Six, and there's a lot of racism, still is, but that's when she wasn't so polite and so nice, is when that stuff happened. And so having that as a young person, and coming from an Italian background too, where like the Italians here were the underclass for a long time too. Yeah. And not in the same way, but seeing some of that, growing up in social housing, I remember dumpster diving as a kid. I remember things like, the drunk guy down the hallway, and even adults you were with going, oh, check to make sure he's alive. And I'm going, I wouldn't, I'm expecting Dad. I would never ask a 7-year-old to do that. That's dangerous. But that's, like, we grew up in that environment. And a lot of the kids that, it sounds cliche, but a lot of the kids, I've reconnected with some of them on Facebook, and you find out a lot of your friends are dead, in jail, or just out of jail, and their lives aren't good. Yeah. So, it's all that sort of stuff. It all makes you who you are. It makes you less judgmental, I hope, but it also makes you have kind of a fire for this. People say, well, what happens in Parliament if, the NDP wants to vote this way and you really don't agree with it? And it's like, you can't scare a guy who's been dumpster diving. You know what I mean? Like, you can't scare somebody who doesn't have anything to lose, who grew up that way. Like, fine, then I stand up to it. That's like, you can't be a pushover, right? But anyway, that's kind of what brought me to politics, weirdly. That, and then I became a social worker. I was working in the media for years, used to edit videos and infomercials and all that stuff, and but I always sort of still volunteered and sort of social justice stuff, and did debating and met a lot of politicians. And I voted Reform in the past, I voted Liberal, and I met Jack Layton shortly after he became leader, and I was a jerk to him. I was a real jerk to him. I have video of me just being like, because I was working in student media, going, hey, you're like the leader of like the last party, what can you ever do? And like stuff like that. And he's just being really polite. He spent tons of time with me, even though I was being a jerk, and he carried his own bags and all that stuff. And I was really impressed by him and a couple other NDP MPs, and that I got to meet when I was going to school in Ottawa. And over time, I sort of realized I'm actually not this right-wing guy. Like, I think there's a version of the right-wing agenda, which is like, I tell some of my friends, like, fiscally, I'm more conservative than my conservative friends, but they believe in, like, it's almost like talk radio conservatism, where it's like, well, the talk radio says it's all about hard work, and it's like, well, yeah, listen, people who are struggling work hard too, and we have systems that keep people poor and keep people unwell, and actually, affordable childcare, it costs some money, but you end up getting double back in the GDP. When you look at, Shannon's Dream, for example, that'll cost some money initially, but it'll actually save you a ton later. Pharmacare saves billions of dollars and keeps people well. Like there's all these economic reasons too that are also ethical reasons to do the things that we're proposing. And I've lived in those poverty systems, and when I was a kid in poverty, it's like you had enough to get out, and now you have enough to be busy being poor, and nobody wants to talk about it. So I helped start the the Brantford Brant Roundtable on Poverty, the Brantford Community Garden Project. And I remember there was all this opposition to working with First Nations and working with Brant Native Housing, and me and Jen Hill were like, screw that. Like, this is a way we can heal some things and show people that despite land claims, there's opportunities to work together on something and like work together. The power of First Nations and settlers working together on land and splitting the goods between them and splitting them between their different food banks. And now there's, I think, over 40 community gardens in town. There used to be none. And the power of that being, first one being on the corner of Mohawk and Brickett Lane, which is now Galakwa House, which Brant Native Housing has. And I mean, that's powerful stuff. And I don't know. So that's kind of where I come from. I know there are ways we can collaborate where it doesn't take over Canadian identity or a Six Nations identity. That the boat and the canoe, the catamaran, and the two-row, because they're our treaties. They're not your treaties and my treaty. They're ours. And I don't know. I see so many opportunities that don't have to be as hard as they are. And again, I think there's a lot of different people pointing this way and the federal government's pointing that way. And often being really dishonest about how they're pointing, saying, oh, they don't want to meet with us and they don't want to. No, that's not true. And I know, because I've been talking to those folks, the same folks. Right. So anyway, it's frustrating, but that's why you got to keep pushing, because no change ever happens from your couch. Right.
Exactly. What would the NDP vote mean for people out here on the reserve in Six Nations, as opposed to voting for someone else?
Well, when we're talking about change, I mean, we've done the internal polls that show me and the Conservatives really close in striking distance. Liberals last time in 2011 were a distant third, and we still see the polls, even the independent ones that are our internal ones, saying that they're still a distant third here. I don't pay attention to the national polls. Like, if 200 people in Vancouver change their mind, suddenly, the aggregates for Ontario say all this stuff. We have local polling results that show that it's a tight two-way here. So there's that part on the change, and, there's nothing strategic about voting for the third place party, and that's where the Liberals are right now. And I think there's a lot of good Liberal ideas. I think there's a lot of good Green ideas. I think there's some really good, actually, Conservative ideas that don't get, they get said, but they don't get acted on. But for me, I became a New Democrat because I agree with most of the policies and most of the solutions and most of the feel. I think for here it means that there's an option. It also means that there's a change. I mean, look, Conservatives haven't got it done, and before that the Liberals didn't get it done either. And I know that when we're looking at so many of the issues that are here, like, we're in line when it comes to things like the environment, when it comes to things like nation-to-nation relationships, when it comes to missing and murdered Indigenous women inquiries, when it comes to equality in education, fire, public safety, inspection, and policing. And former Chief Montour has said publicly, and publicly in chambers before, that Six Nations has a voice in Parliament with the NDP. He also said recently on Facebook, that the Conservatives aren't the friends to Six Nations, and his experience was, as a chief for a long period of time, that Liberals weren't either, and that maybe it's time to give the NDP a try. Last election, I won every poll in New Credit and Six Nations, which I was really grateful for. But I think part of the reason I did that is somebody who, I was running against a former MP and the current MP. And I think part of the reason was because I came out and I showed up and I listened, and I don't take things and say, oh, absolutely not, we won't be doing that. If there's some merit to the idea, I can be convinced. And I think we need that, as opposed to, well, my party's lines are this and that's what we're going to do and say. So, there are options for change, but there's no local option that's going to be stronger. There's nobody who's brought more MPs to Six Nations and New Credit than I have. There's nobody who's had more town halls here and out there in Brantford and Brant. There's nobody who's had more, free and open events. That's how I do things. We had Justin Trudeau came to town in 2009 during my nomination meeting. He didn't come for me, obviously. He had a $90 a plate dinner to talk about youth issues. And the reason they did it was because I was 28 when I started running, and he was like the young MP at the time. And, they're going to do this thing, they're going to talk about youth, and they're going to push the NDP off the front page. That's fine. So what I did instead was 2 months later, I had Jack Layton down, we had a 90-cent dinner. Because access is important, right? We had young people saying, wait a second, they're talking about youth issues at a $90 a plate dinner? Like, youth can't afford $90 a plate.
What kid can spend $90 on a
Yeah,
dinner, you know?
yeah, and well, you know, there's a kid rate of $45. Still, like, kids. That's anyway. That's not. It seemed very false. So, you know, 90 cents. I've never had an expensive event. I believe in that accessibility because, look, we shouldn't have to pay to access politicians, and pick up the phone based on like who donated to your campaign and who didn't, you know, or who voted for you and who didn't. There are folks here who are voting. There are folks who are listening to what the AFN has said about, you know, Brant being one of the few ridings, one of the 51 out of 338 that could change if First Nations voted in any sort of way. I understand all the reasons not to vote from a conscientious objection point of view, absolutely. And if those are your long-held beliefs, then you know they should be with you. But if you are considering voting, and you know, I don't think a lot of folks on Six Nations are going to be voting for the Conservatives, but we can't split the vote. I had more votes last time than the Greens and the Liberals combined.
Wow.
And it's not like I rested in between. You know, I took 3 days off after the last election. I took 2 weeks off for my honeymoon. And other than that, you know, I've been door knocking every month and often every day. I've been out. I've been pushing hard. If people want to get to know sort of me and where I stand on things, I have a Tumblr page, Brant Marc, and it's Marc with a C, .tumblr, TUMBLR.com. And if you're interested in Six Nations and First Nations issues, there's a search bar. And you can type in Six Nations and see everything I've ever said in the media about Six Nations. You can see everything I've ever said about First Nations. You can see columns that me and Romeo Saganash, the first ever Cree lawyer and one of our NDP MPs, a good friend of mine, I supported him for leader of the NDP, columns we've written. You can see things I've written for, you know, the Two Row Times. I've written a bunch of columns there. You can see consistency over a long period of time, fighting the HST, all that stuff. Those are issues here where we can ally. But yeah, no, my door's open, and I think people want to see some younger folks too. And I'm 34, and I'm in it for the next 40 years, not the next 4. So well, thanks so much for having me.